So in Idaho, there is a teenager that was shot by the police, and he is autistic, and his name is Victor Perez. So there is different video footage. So there's video footage of him like waving a knife. And also I saw like other footage where he's like on the ground, like waving a knife at one of his relatives, and they were using like a stick to try to smack the knife out of his hand. And somebody reports that, possibly a drunk person is wielding a knife, and then the police officers arrive and they're like, get the fuck on the ground, get the fuck on the ground. And also what happens is that he charges while holding his knife up, and they shoot him 9 times, but there's also a fence. So there's a lot of different arguments about this that, first of all, somebody said a drunk man, so maybe the police officers did not know that he was autistic. But also, if somebody's intoxicated and not in control of their actions and dangerous, you know, there are many situations, and I think the first thing should be de-escalation. And I think that, obviously, shooting somebody 9 times is excessive. There are situations where you may want to use a taser or non-lethal force. There may be a situation where you want to shoot somebody in the arm or another part of the body to do it more safely. But just randomly shooting somebody 9 times and surrounding them in like a semicircle is definitely excessive. But I can also understand too, you don't know if he's going to throw the knife or what he's going to do because it's an unpredictable environment. So I understand both sides of the arguments where police officers have to defend themselves. And there are plenty of countries like Japan where they're excessively trained in defending themselves. But then what usually happens is that somebody gets cut a couple of times before they actually subdue somebody. So I understand, the need to defend yourself, but there's also a need to be, reasonable force. And I feel, quite honestly, this was excessive force, really. And even when they said, like, get the fuck on the ground, get the fuck on the ground, it just showed that they were very much about being aggressive. But, their conduct was unprofessional. And I also will say that one thing that is a little lost is that the person reporting the incident said, it looks like a drunk person, or this guy's really, really drunk. So I guess, one thing is that maybe they did not know that this person was autistic. And I didn't see any video footage of the mother or anybody screaming, he's autistic, he has a learning disability, or anything like that, really. So that's also important, that the police did not hear that. But I do feel that a couple of things that, it did feel like it was shoot to kill. It feel like they were not about de-escalation. I feel like they were just about seeing somebody as a threat and subduing the threat, and then almost having the mentality of, even if you're drunk, or even if you're mentally ill, or there's something off with you psychologically, if you're a threat, we got to put you down. And that's not always the best method, but I do understand why people have to do that, because there is that thing too of, you have to defend yourself, really. And I remember watching video footage years and years ago in high school of a black man, and he was on cocaine, and he was like holding a knife, and he was like about to stab a police officer, and then he got shot a couple of times. And then my teacher, who was the police officer, was saying that that's not racism, that's just reasonable force because he presented a threat. I remember watching footage on television of a guy who was on psychedelics, and he was running around with a kitchen knife, and he was charging at police officers, and he was shot to death, really. So there is a thing about self-defense. And there's also a thing about, accommodation culture, where we can't make autistic people or mentally ill people above the law, because if we live in that type of world, then mentally ill people are going to run amok, really. Or even if you have a mentally ill person who doesn't understand anything about their actions, really, they're just going to do whatever, really. Like, for example, I work in a hospital, and there's this patient who has like mental health issues, and he screams all night. And what happened was the nurse telling him to stop, and he's like laughing like a baby, But the thing about it is that everybody on his floor is not getting sleep because he's allowed to scream and yell and find it hilarious when it's very clear that he knows what he's doing is disruptive. So, and people are telling him to shut up and whatever. So, you don't want to live in a world where mentally ill people are allowed to run amok, really. And I also will say that one time when I did the 48-hour film project, they had a meet and greet where people would join teams. And there was this guy who had an autistic son, and the autistic son was obsessed with holding a butter knife. So he's kind of swinging a butter knife at a bunch of people. And a bunch of people were always kind of like had their eyes on this kid, like, what's going to happen? Or he's going to poke somebody's eye out with a butter knife or other things like that. So, it it is a controversial argument. And I think that that's the answer. I think that self-defense is important, but conduct is more important as well. I think that they executed self-defense in a very piss-poor conduct type of way. They surrounded him, they shot him dead. They heard that this person was drunk, so they probably could have de-escalated it a lot more. And then also there was a fence keeping this guy in, really. So, and it didn't look like he was about to jump over the fence or whatever, really. So they honestly could have just, done a lot more to de-escalate this, or use non-lethal force, or use something like a taser or a BB gun, or a pellet gun to just, or even like mace or whatever to kind of settle it that way, and it didn't look like this person was about to throw the knife. If he was about to throw it, then I would understand because that's a clear threat. But then again, you have to make the split judgment. But I also will say that surrounding somebody and shooting them 9 times is extremely excessive. Like, I understand, I think that's unreasonable force. I think that honestly, somebody had like a gun or like an automatic gun, like a school shooter or something like that, then it would be reasonable to shoot them up, really. But I think that this was definitely unreasonable. And then the other thing too is that I remember like seeing the footage. There was a black man on the lawn, and then also this family is Latino, and he's clearly Latino. So obviously, it kind of goes down to that saying, if he was a white, if he was a white child, if he was a white girl, if this was in an upper class white neighborhood, more than likely we know how it goes. This person would be stabbing away, really, and then, this kid will go to like a mental institution and then be out in a couple of months. Like, really just a lack of consequence, because we also know that race plays a part in it. And then also too, you look at the news and there's a lot of targeting of transsexual people, LGBTQ people, and there's also a lot of targeting of illegal immigrants, and a lot of that is people from Mexico, really. So it may be in the police's psychology to be psychology, sociology, to say, hey, you know what, this is just another spick that we can just shoot dead, really. And I'm not saying that to be offensive. I'm just saying that that's probably that could be their psychology. We see you as we see you as the slur. We don't see you as a human being, and we're going to do what we want to because of what's been going on in the news. Just like in the 70s and the 80s and during the civil rights era, where police probably thought of every black person that they arrested as a nigger, and they treated them such by, police brutality or shooting them or having the lynch mob do whatever and exonerating them. It's definitely clear that, as I said, imagine if he was white, what would they do? Imagine if he was a school shooter. Like, look what happened to Dylan Roof when he shot up the church. The police arrested him. They had a nice laugh. It was all calm. They took him to Burger King. Would they do the same thing to this kid? And they clearly didn't. So Latina, like, because he's Latino, ethnicity and race does play a part in this. But I think that, as I said, if I was a police officer and I was in that situation, and somebody was charging me with a knife, and there was a fence in front of me, quite honestly, I would have shot them probably in the arm or something like that, like in a non-lethal way. Or I would have used a taser or a stun gun and or other like non-lethal force. I would have fired my gun to stop what's going on, to save the person, to stop to stop the onslaught, but to protect myself. And that's what I think should have happened, really. But surrounding a person who people who have been reported to be drunk, and shooting them over 9 times is not appropriate. And like I've said, I do not think the officers knew that he was autistic or not. But if they knew, then that's way worse, because then they know that this person has a mental disability. And maybe the person can be reasoned with, and maybe they can't be. But even though I presented both sides of the argument, I will say that, in my opinion, it was excessive force. It was aimed to shoot to kill, and it was aimed to terminate the threat, instead of saying, hey, this is somebody who is not right in the head. Hey, when somebody called 911, they said that this person was drunk. Hey, when usually people are told to arrest somebody, these are the facts that they get. Like, this person is drunk or this person's on drugs, when that is shared to 911. So I do feel it was excessive force. I do feel their goal was to kill instead of actually subdue the person. And I also feel that, the person was charging, unless he made a gesture of throwing the knife, I don't feel that shooting him was, I don't feel shooting him dead or trying to shoot him dead was appropriate. But I really feel that, if they did aim to tase him, or if they had a plan to say, hey, hey guys, on the radio, before we get out of the car, we're going to talk maybe 10 seconds, and we're going to think about a plan to make sure this guy is subdued without, killing him. That needs to be top priority, really. It reminds me of that episode of Family Matters, where Eddie was, a little too gun crazy as a police officer. And then what Carl did was that he made one of the targets a picture of Laura to show him, hey, you know what, when you go out there with a gun and you make a split-second decision, you have to think about, the life that you're taking. And imagine if it was imagine what other police officer did that to a family member. And I also remember one time I was almost murdered by the police because I worked at a store that was robbed by its own security guards. I remember when the cops were aiming at me, they were grinning almost shooting me was funny. And I remember struggling with suicidal thoughts. This was the Hamden Police Department for many, many years. And like I said, the officers that did that, they probably just went home and just did nothing about it. They were just, probably like, oh, well, it's just another nigger. Just another nigger. We'll just go home and forget about it, type of thing, really, So yeah, it does happen, and it's not a great experience to be on two sides of the coin, really. And then I would also ask the police officers, what would happen if they had an elderly relative who was in the hospital and they were holding on to a knife or a butter knife or a piece of glass or something like that, and hospital security shot them dead. And they saw footage of a couple of hospital people surrounding them with guns. I would ask them if they have a kid who is, let's say they have a 6 or 7 year old kid, and let's say the kid is playing with a knife or doing something crazy outside or playing with a toy gun or a BB gun, and people surround the kid, a couple officers surround the kid and shoot them like that. I would ask them if they have a relative who has mental illness and they surround the kid with a gun, with 9 police officers on a gun, and they shot them, how would they feel? Sometimes you have to be like, you know what, if this was somebody that I cared about, this was my relative, how would I handle the situation, really? And really their attitude is just like in Full Metal Jacket, hey, you know what, we shoot somebody, life sucks, move the fuck on, and let's pray to God we don't get out of trouble, and let's just not have any form of sympathy, let's just think let's be sociopathic, let's just move on to the next thing, whatever happens, happens. So it's very unfortunate that this happens. Um, I would also say that, you know, definitely there's two sides of this. There's definitely the rights of people with mental health issues, and then there's also a very much like, it doesn't matter your psychology, you have to hold people accountable, and people are threatening, people have to make good judgments, but we also have to dissect excessive force as well, really. And like I've said, we cannot live in a world where police do whatever the hell they want, and you also can't live in a world where mentally ill people do whatever the hell they want, really, because both are not good outcomes. And as someone who's worked in a hospital, I've seen like nurses get assaulted by patients and they have to file paperwork and everything like that. Most of them choose to let it go, even if it's a kid or whatever. So, so that's why I do believe that mentally ill people need to be held accountable for their actions. Um, that's a tough situation, but I'm more on the side in this situation, particularly that the police use excessive force and they could have de-escalated the situation. And even if they just knew that this person was drunk, or that's what they heard, that's what they believed, and it was actually something else, I I really really think that they could have just de-escalated this. And it's very unfortunate that this person may be dead. This person is brain damaged, and more than likely what's going to happen is if he survives and if they say not guilty, the family's going to be buried with medical bills. Or they may say, hey, we got to take him off. We got to let him die because, we can't be spending, tens of thousands of dollars on his treatment because that's going to bankrupt the family. Or they may do that, and then all the kids' college funds or other like expenses they have, like retirement's going to go towards that kid's medical bills, So, or, the police are found guilty, then the state has to pay for that. And that's going to be like, you know, that could be millions of dollars in a lifetime, or that could be tens of millions, So yeah, it's a very unfortunate situation, definitely, when we make choices or we're in charge of other people's lives, or we're in charge of controlling other people who are out of control, we definitely have to think about, imagine the person you love and somebody was making the choice to control them with lethal and non-lethal force. And then the other thing too is that even though it's hard, and even though it's hard to raise people with mental illness, you always have to, put in extra work. Obviously, I'm not sure how this kid got to the point of holding a knife, and I do understand that you can't monitor people 24/7. You may have people who have a screaming tantrum or maybe violent, and that's what you get. Really, it's not easy to always be in control of someone with a mental health issue. So, so yeah, but also you understand that these are the things that do happen when you have a kid like that. Unfortunately, these things do happen, and the best thing to do is just is to lock everything up when you have a kid like that, or you have to be like, okay, this person has violent tendencies. How do I manage? Do I put them on medication? This person likes to get into things they're not supposed to have, like weapons or other things like that. How do I make sure, they're not touching these items, and they're kept safe, because these things like this do happen, really. So it's definitely some, a lot of talking points, but I gave you my direct answer. When I look at this, they use excessive force. They were not aiming to subdue. They were not aiming to de-escalate. They were aiming to kill. And I do wonder what would happen if this was a white kid with special needs, because more than likely, that person would be alive and doing well. And definitely more so if it was a white kid in a rich neighborhood.